All right, so it is about 5 minutes after now, so let's go ahead and get started with the workshop. Today I am going to be presenting on test-taking strategies for multiple choice tests. These are not going to talk about study strategies, so this is simply what you should do right here as the test is in front of you, all of those strategies that you can implement so that you can be successful. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with today's workshop. So today's workshop objectives are to, one, understand the different types of multiple choice questions and what they measure. So we're going to look at all of the different kinds of questions that you could be asked. We're going to describe some of the best strategies for taking those sorts of tests. And then we're going to talk about something called elimination rules for multiple choice tests. We're going to identify all of those rules, and this is how you can eliminate certain choices so that you can select the correct answer. So before we get started, let's talk about class objectives. So you probably know class objectives as that little blurb on the first page of your class syllabus. You probably go over it on the first day of class, and then you as a student probably don't ever return back to that section. But class objectives are actually very important, and they're vitally important when determining what may or may not be on a test. Class objectives describe what you are expected to learn over the course of that class. And they are all based on something called Bloom's taxonomy. And I do not expect you to remember the name of that, but all you do have to understand is what you see here on the left, this pyramid. This is called Bloom's taxonomy, and you will likely find, if you are to go back to your class syllabus and look at your class objectives, that the action word or the verb that is found in that objective usually fall in line with one of these: remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. Now, it might not be those exact words, but usually they are words along these lines. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Bloom's taxonomy and how this is going to determine the different types of multiple choice questions you could potentially be asked on a test. So what Bloom's taxonomy describes is that there are different levels of learning. You'll notice that when I read to you the different action words in Bloom's taxonomy on the pyramid here, I started from the bottom of the pyramid and I went up from there. You start with remember and you work your way all the way up to create. This shows that there are different levels of learning, and it goes from lower level learning, so simply being able to remember something, all the way up to higher level learning, being able to create something new. This doesn't necessarily mean that what is at the bottom of the pyramid is easiest and what is at the top is the hardest. You may find that some are easier or harder than others, but you do have to take into consideration that you usually have to remember in order to understand, understand in order to apply, apply in order to analyze, analyze in order to evaluate, and evaluate in order to create. It's sort of like this saying that you have to crawl before you can walk. The same is true for learning. So what is a multiple choice test? You've probably taken so many of them in your school years, in college, but what a multiple choice test does is measures your ability to recognize the correct answer among other incorrect information. So being able to recognize which is right and which is wrong. Most multiple choice questions fall into the first category on Bloom's taxonomy, on the pyramid here. Not all of them, but most questions do fall under this lower level of learning. That is not to say that higher level multiple choice questions do not exist. They certainly do exist. And what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through each of these action words on Bloom's taxonomy on this pyramid, and we're going to look at what these types of multiple choice questions look like so that you can go back to your class objectives, see what you're expected to learn, and so that you can apply that to when you take the test. All right, so remember level questions. Think of this as being level 1. This is the first level on the pyramid. This measures your ability to recognize and recall information. Now, recall back that we just talked about how multiple choice questions, they are there for you to recognize the correct answer among a list of incorrect answers. And so you see that word recognize again. You may need to recognize and recall dates, events, people, places. It could be key terms or vocabulary words. You might need to recognize the correct definition. And here are some examples of questions that are in this first level, the remember level. So what is the definition of blank? So that could be any vocabulary or key term. You're asked to select the definition from a list of choices, and you simply have to recognize the correct definition. What year did blank, a certain event, occur? So once again, you sort of just have to recall back to the textbook, to the lecture, to the PowerPoint, to be able to recognize that correct year. Who invented the blank, whatever the invention is. So once again, you do just have to sort of recognize the correct answer from a list of incorrect answers. When I say recognize, I mean that you're not having to think of a fill in the blank question. For those questions, you have to actually not only recognize, you have to recall and bring to your mind the correct answer. You have no hints there and you have to write it out. Being able to recognize is completely separate and very much different than, say, a fill in the blank, and completely different from the type of level of learning that you have to use in order to, say, write an essay or a short response. All right, so let's talk about level 2, which are the understand level questions. And understanding is really all about comprehending the meaning of certain information. So you may be asked to relate something to something else, be able to summarize, say, a book that you read, to be able to compare and contrast two different key terms or vocabulary words. And so here are 2 examples of understand level questions. So what is the key difference between blank and blank? So in this example, you have to understand what is the first blank, and you have to understand what is the second blank, and you have to know what the difference is between the 2. The second example is, which of the following are key reasons for blank? And so this is really being able to summarize. It's not asking you to compare and contrast, but you do need to have a key understanding of whatever that blank is in order to talk about the reasons. But once again, you do only need to recognize the answer from a list of choices. Applied level questions. So now as we sort of go up the pyramid, these types of questions, depending on the subject you are taking the multiple choice test in, may be more or less common. So these are applied level questions, and they are most common in math and also in science. And so this is all about applying different rules, applying different methods, and then of course formulas to a new situation, or in the case of math, an equation. So here are 2 examples. Which of the following is a real world example of the following equation? Velocity equals distance divided by time. So there you have to take the equation and you have to apply it to some sort of real world example. except in this instance, you just have to choose the correct real-world example that shows that following equation. And then, of course, there is math questions, and that is where you do have to actually take a formula and you have to apply it to an equation in order to select the right answer. So this is definitely the most common for math and science, and least common for history and humanities and subjects like that. Analyze level questions. So this is measuring your ability to identify different patterns and relationships or different parts of a whole. So are you able to classify? Are you able to establish a basis for something? And then you may also be able to asked to look over, say, a diagram and be able to determine whether it correctly illustrates a certain concept that you've gone over in class. So those are all examples of analyze level questions. Evaluating, so now we're getting to the top of the pyramid here, and this is having the ability to use evidence or other reasoned arguments in order to form your own judgment or opinion. So as you could probably tell, this is going to be more difficult to do in a multiple choice question. These types of questions are mostly reserved for other short response or essay type questions, but it is completely possible for you to have a multiple choice question that is asking you to evaluate something. It may ask you to judge a statement using certain criteria that are listed in the question, or it could be some sort of scenario. So it could be, for example, a sociology test, and you're given an example of an example scenario, and you have to determine which sociological principle that scenario covers. It could also be a problem-solving question, so to have a passage that you have to read over, and there's a problem that you're being asked to solve with multiple choices. And then create level questions. So you are least likely to have these types of questions on a multiple choice test, but once again, it is not impossible for you to have these types of questions. It's simply because creating means coming up with something brand new. It is discovering or creating new connections or perspectives, and that's pretty difficult to do when you are given options. Whatever you select isn't really brand new, it's just, selected from the different choices. These are usually found in some more advanced problem-solving type questions that involve, say, 4 choices that are all correct, but you have to select the best option from that list of correct answers. So these definitely take the most thinking and problem-solving skills. Remember that create is at the top of the pyramid, the top of Bloom's taxonomy, and so it is the highest level of learning there is. So once again, you're not likely to have these types of questions, but they are out there and they do exist. So definitely be aware that this is an option. Now that we've talked about different types of multiple choice questions, let's go ahead and jump into those strategies for taking multiple choice tests. First, I know I said I wasn't going to get into study strategies, and I'm not going to go in depth here, but you have to make sure that you are preparing for success. You want to prepare for the grade that you want. And so practice tests, flashcards, and study guides are all really good ways to prepare for a multiple choice test. And you want to make sure that on the day of your test that you are getting enough sleep. So I always recommend 7 or more hours of sleep the night before a test. Of course, if you can sleep more, go ahead and do that. But understanding that not everyone can get 8 hours of sleep each night. And you also want to make sure that you're feeding your brain. It is totally normal to feel anxious or nervous for a test. And sometimes when that happens, you don't feel like eating too much. So you definitely do want to make sure you have something you do want to feed your brain, because what happens is when you eat a nutritious meal, it fuels your body it not just fuels your body, it fuels your mind. So make sure that if you have a morning test, you go ahead and eat breakfast, even if it's a piece of toast. You know, if it's the afternoon, eat lunch, and the evening, eat dinner. Make sure you're feeding your brain. Arrive on time. So this is going to look a little bit different now that we are all in this online environment, but you definitely still want to arrive on time to your test. Think of it this way. If you are given, say, an entire day from 8 to 6 p.m. to complete your test, but the moment you sit down, you have a total of 2 hours to finish that test. It might be wise for you to say, okay, at 1 p.m., I'm going to sit down and I'm going to take my test. It's 2 hours long, so from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., I'm going to take my test. Go ahead and schedule it with yourself and make sure that you arrive on time. At 1 p.m., you should sit down and you should make sure you're starting your test. Don't put it off because you know you have a little bit more time. Set that expectation with yourself and go with it. Something else is that you do want to look over your test at least once before you go ahead and click that submit button. There are so many easy mistakes that you can make on a test, especially on a multiple choice test. So you definitely want to skim through it at least once before turning it in, because you know it happens to the best of us. It's going to happen. And so we'll talk a little bit more about these really simple mistakes that can be made and how we can avoid them. So the biggest one is to pay attention and to read carefully. So this might seem very simple, and of course I'm going to pay attention. Of course I'm going to read all the questions carefully. But you want to make sure that you're reading all of the directions and all of your questions carefully. I cannot reiterate this enough. You want to beware of misleading language, and this is very common in multiple choice questions. There's often misleading language. Questions that say it's not uncommon for, which of the following is not, all of the following except, and then there are those choices of all of the above or none of the above. All of these use misleading language to sort of check you, to make sure that you are reading carefully so that you can select the right answer. If you don't read carefully, if you just sort of fly through that question, you could be answering incorrectly, even though you completely believe that you've read the question and that you know the answer. Especially for questions like all of the following except, if you skip over that except, then you can see, say a correct answer is A, and you read it and you know it's right, and so you circle it. But really you want to choose the one that's false, not necessarily the one that's true. And so you definitely just want to take a moment. Instead of flying through those questions, take a moment and read it and process it and understand what is being asked of you. Budgeting your time wisely is also going to be very important. So when you get the test, look to see how many questions are on that test. If you scroll down or you flip through the pages, depending on how you're taking your test, you see that there are 30 questions. You know that you have an hour and a half to complete the test. And so now you can divide your time by the number of questions. For the example, that's 90 minutes divided by 30 questions is going to be about 3 minutes per question. We know that some questions, they are not going to take that long, but some questions might take you longer. So you really just sort of want to keep track of your time, make sure that you're sticking to these time guidelines that you're setting for yourself so that you can complete your test in that 90-minute time frame. You can even, at 15 questions, check to see the time and see if you're halfway through. If you are, wonderful. If you're more than halfway through, you know you have to sort of speed it up a little bit. But another thing is you don't want to pay too much attention on the time, and that's why I recommend sort of waiting until that 15 question halfway mark to check to see how well you're doing with time. You don't want to focus too much on the time so that after every question you're checking the clock. that can sort of be a time waster as well. You'll focus more on the time than you are on the question, when really you want to pay attention to the question itself. Something else, and I've talked to many students about this before, and it sort of is a new concept to them, that they don't have to actually answer the questions on a test in order. It's so, ingrained in us that we just sort of read the questions and we try and answer it right then and there. Read over a question carefully, and if it's an easy question, go ahead and answer it. Of course, go ahead and answer it. You read question number 1. Oh, this is an easy one. The answer is C. Select that answer. You get to question number 2, and you know that this one is going to be a thinker. It's a little bit more difficult. You don't quite know the answer yet. Go ahead and somehow mark that question, circle that question, and continue on through the test. Go to question 3. Oh, an easy question. Complete it. Question 4. Oh, okay, I'm going to have to spend a little more time on this one. You do not have to answer every question in order. You can always go back. But with that being said, at this point, you do have to remember to return to these questions before turning in your test. So this is one of those silly mistakes that I talked about earlier. You want to do a once through of your test before turning it in to make sure you haven't missed one. Remember to return to these questions, and that's going to be a little bit more difficult now that we're in the online environment. You're not taking paper tests right now, and so you do have to remember before clicking that submit button, you've got to scroll back up to the top and do a once over and make sure you've answered everything. But you don't have to answer in order. You can answer all those easy questions first, get them out of the way, and now you have more time to focus on the ones that are going to take you longer. Another strategy for taking a multiple choice test is to answer the question before reading the choices. So turn these multiple choice questions into a short answer or fill in the blank type question. This challenges you to go ahead and read the question carefully, and then before you take a look at the choices in your head, try to come up with the answer. Try to answer the question without reading the choices. It might not work for all types of questions. Usually these kinds of questions are the remember level or the understand level questions, usually for ones that are more higher level, so ones where you have to apply a formula or you have an equation, ones where you're being asked to problem solve. Those might not be ones that you're able to answer in your head prior to reading the choices. But for those level 1 and level 2 type questions, definitely try it. And if you're confident in that answer that you've got in your mind and you see it as a choice there, then you know the answer. There's no reason to focus too much longer on that question. Let's talk about a multiple choice test myth. So something that has been repeated, throughout school is that you should always go with what your gut instinct tells you is the right answer, and that you should never change that answer, that your gut instinct is always correct. Now, I call this a myth, and let's talk about what that reality is if you have a good reason to believe that another answer is correct, so that means you remember all of a sudden you read the next question and it reminds you of the PowerPoint or the lecture of a class a few weeks ago. And you know that question you just answered, you didn't select the right one. You don't believe you selected the right one there. Typically, people will say, well, go with your gut instinct. There's a reason why you thought that other one was correct. Well, if you have a good reason to believe that this new answer is correct, go ahead and change your answer. There was research done to show that most answer changes on a multiple choice test are from an incorrect answer to a correct answer, and that people who change their answers are actually improving their test scores. So don't just second guess yourself. That's not what I'm saying. But if you do have that good reason to believe that another option is correct, even after you've selected another option, definitely go take a second look at it. And if that good reason, really tells you to go for that other answer, go ahead and change it. You could be changing it from wrong to right. All right, so this is going to be our last section, and we're going to talk about elimination rules for multiple choice tests. When I say elimination rules, this is simply the rules that you can use in order to eliminate the different choices on a multiple choice test so that you can select the right one. So rule number one is to get rid of distractors, get rid of the wrong answers. When you get a multiple choice test, you typically have 4 options to choose from, A, B, C, or D. So say you read through the question and you can't quite answer it in your head. Maybe you've got an idea, but you have to read the choices. So you read A, you read B, you read C, you read D. You know for a fact that B and D, they're wrong. They're the wrong answer. Go ahead and, in your mind, physically, somehow, cross them off. Do not look at them again. They will distract you from the right answer. Don't consider them, because I know for more difficult questions, and I've done this too, you get the question, 2 are wrong, you debate between A and C for a couple of minutes, but then B starts looking really tempting again. Even though you know it's wrong, you still sort of consider it, even though you know it's wrong. So try and cross it out. I know it's more difficult when we're online here, but just sort of block it out of your mind. Don't consider it. It's a distractor. Rule number 2 is to consider your absolutes. So it is usually a good idea to eliminate options that contain sort of these absolute 100% words like always, never, none, nobody, everybody, because typically there are very few absolutes out there. You can more easily trust options that include less than 100% words, or qualifiers like frequently or some or probably, most, generally. Now, I don't want to say an absolute statement. I'm not saying that you will never see a correct answer with 100% absolute words. Sometimes you will. Most times you won't. So that's just something to consider when you get those choices. If some are, this is always true, this is never true, really consider it. But if it's not correct, just go ahead and cross it out. Following the clues. So grammatical clues are another good way to just sort of eliminate answers from a multiple choice question. You want to eliminate the answers that don't necessarily make sense with the question stem. So sometimes incorrect answers may look correct, they may contain some correct information, but they do not make any sense grammatically. You want to make sure that the question and the answer match each other. Completely unfamiliar terms is another way that you could be thrown off on a multiple choice test. If you see an answer that contains a word that you have never seen in your life, you've read the book, you've gone through your notes, you went to all the lectures, you've looked through all the PowerPoints, and you know for a fact that your professor never went over this term before, it is completely unfamiliar to you. That's a distraction that's trying to distract you. Eliminate it. If they weren't covered in class or on the book, then that's not going to be the answer to the question. And then another thing is, I talked a little bit about all of the above and none of the above. You don't want to be fooled by these. Just because they exist, just because they're a choice, does not mean it's the correct answer. This is sort of a common thought that if all of the above is there, that all of the above is the answer, and that's not necessarily true. So if you see all of the above as an option, really consider, is more than one answer correct? If you could really only identify one of those answers as being correct, then go ahead and select that answer and ignore all of the above together. This is not always going to be the right answer. All right, everyone. So I want to wish you the best of luck during finals week next week. If you do have any questions, whether it is about test taking skills, or you sort of want to go over your study strategy or study plan that you have going leading into finals week, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. My name is Sam. I'm not sure I said that at the beginning of the presentation, but you can always email me at dzurgas@tcc.fl.edu. And thank you for coming today.